Coming up, journalism on the front lines.
To be a journalist is to have a commitment to certain core liberal values around freedom of expression.
Slate's Jacob Weisberg and Committee to Protect journalist Joel Simon discuss the many issues surrounding press freedom. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Good afternoon. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us as we welcome Jacob Weisberg, Editor-in-Chief of the Slate Group, who will be interviewing Joel Simon, Executive Director of Committee to Protect Journalists. Together, they will be discussing CPJ's annual publication, Attacks on the Press.
I am here in my capacity as a member of the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And for those of you who don't know, this is an organization that does incredibly important work, not just intervening and working on behalf of journalists who are in physical jeopardy, and trying to look out both for American and international journalists in every country in the world in which they're in serious physical danger, but also in being an advocate for the rights of the press, for freedom of reporting, and for the expanding world of what can be considered journalism. Joel has been not only a friend of mine, but director for many years and has presided over a real growth in what the organization takes on. But it's interesting this year, we do this book every year, Attacks on the Press. This is an extremely valuable survey every year that's usually very focused on physical jeopardy, places where journalists are threatened, killed, imprisoned, tortured for doing their jobs. And also we've been very focused on the issue of impunity. That is, whether the people who do threaten and unharm journalists are subjected to any possible risk of prosecution. But this year, we led with a series of essays, one that you wrote, an introduction I wrote, and a longer piece by Jeff King, not about physical threats to journalists, but about a more abstract threat of surveillance. And I wanted to ask you, Joel, to start out by kind of giving your thoughts on doing that, to elevating that issue to prominence alongside, people in Pakistan, Egypt, Vietnam, India, Iran, all the countries where to be a journalist can involve taking your life in your hands.
Well, I think there's been an evolution in what we understand, or the meaning of press freedom. And press freedom traditionally has meant the physical integrity of the people who involved in gathering and disseminating this information, their ability to carry out this critical work, and the legal and regulatory environment in which they operate. But technology has completely transformed this process in a way that makes the actual medium, the communication infrastructure, the global communication infrastructure, critically important to the exercise of this function. And so any threat to that infrastructure is an issue for us. And in the last year, or more than that really, but certainly it's come to the head in the last year, surveillance has emerged as a threat to this new system, of this new global information order. And there are several ways in which this has occurred. One is that obviously journalists can't do their work if they can't protect their sources, if they can't communicate with the people they need to communicate with in order to gather and disseminate this information. And the awareness now of the pervasiveness of surveillance has changed the equation for many journalists. And the second is sort of directly affects journalists themselves and the work that they do. The second is more abstract, and it's just a confidence in the medium itself and its independence, its ability to kind of function independent of government intrusion and involvement. And I think that has fundamentally shifted in the last year as well. So I think those are the two issues that we're focusing on.
So you see the issue of whether journalists can do their job and how they have to do their job as a censorship issue, or would you keep it distinct?
It's not necessarily a censorship issue. It can become one. But surveillance doesn't necessarily produce direct censorship in that the information can still be gathered and disseminated. Often what comes are the consequences of that. and the consequences could accrue to the journalists themselves or to their sources. And so you see, what you often see is self-censorship, an unwillingness to undertake certain kinds of reporting or difficulties in undertaking that kind of reporting because of the perception that it's the communication itself is monitored, that the surveillance is essentially smothering.
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit and say that national security reporting is always a bit of a cat and mouse game. Often, long before we were talking about any of these surveillance issues, sources are breaking the law, taking grave risk to their own careers and possibly their freedom by talking to journalists. Journalists still have the same protections we've always had.
Well, in this country.
In this country,
right?
Talking about in this country. So you know, maybe the cat's gotten a little better, and the mouse has got to be a little mousier to do this kind of reporting. But given where the technology has gone, isn't that just the inevitable evolution?
Well, I think there's a fundamental shift. I mean, I think that the perception of how the technology is utilized has, I think many people think about it very differently. If you talk about journalists and the way they communicate, they think about the risk in different ways. And I think that the key is also to internationalize this phenomenon. Because to my mind, what's happened in this country, and with the Snowden revelations and the increasing awareness about the NSA's ability to track communication, keep in mind that some of it is, you know, so there's a big uproar in this country, but most of the risk is actually outside the United States, when you were talking about NSA surveillance. And the risk from national governments is even greater. Because this technology, to my mind, is a bit like drone technology. Right now, the United States and the NSA has this tremendous technological advantage. What you need in order to carry out this kind of surveillance is cheap data storage. And the price of data storage is coming down, it's coming down, it's coming down. And so I think more and more governments are going to undertake this kind of surveillance operations, and that's going to have a tremendous impact on journalists at the national level.
So if you're an American journalist covering national security, practically you actually, your work is very different than it was several years ago. I mean, you've got to become an expert on encryption. There are questions about whether you can have any way to offer a source a genuine guarantee of anonymity.
Exactly. The whole notion of you know, issuing a subpoena to a journalist to get them to reveal their sources may be obsolete. I mean, there's actually been reported exchanges of law enforcement basically saying we're not going to need subpoenas. We're going to be able to we're not going to need to subpoena journalists because we can subpoena the people you've communicated with, get their emails, find out who they've been talking to, and that process is, we're seeing that already.
But let's go to the sort of question of the sort of responsibility, the national responsibility of journalists. I mean, you run an organization of journalists, not all American, mostly American, but with the international representation. In the 1980s, when I started out as a journalist, this was pretty easy. You wrote for an American audience. You know, the issue didn't come up very much where your responsibilities lie. Now it does. I mean, you can be a journalist in any country writing for an audience in other countries, including your own country. If you're a journalist, how do you think about it? I mean, how do you think about your moral responsibility, and how do you think about your national responsibility?
I think it's a muddle. I mean, the moral responsibility, and ironically, is somewhat easier to parse. I mean, I think that most journalists operate within a framework in which, you know, any information that can be made public should be made public, and you know, that has to be done in a way that's, you know, takes into account the, you know, different perspectives, and has to be, you know, there has to be work done to ensure the accuracy of the information. But, you know, you kind of have this, you know, let the chips fall where they may approach. But, you know, determining, you know, when you go to a national government and how much, you know, with this information, we have information that's potentially damaging to your national interest or your national security interest, and giving the government the opportunity to argue that the information should not be revealed or should be, you know, we know this happens in the United States. Well, what do you do if it's, you know, Pakistan or Mexico or Russia or China or some other country making that argument, and you're not a citizen of those countries? How do you determine what the right thing to do is?
to be a journalist is to have a commitment to certain core liberal values around freedom of expression, around protection for human rights, probably around representative government. And so long as your country is in accord with those basic values and operates according to the rule of law, you owe them an obligation. But if you are practicing journalism in a country where none of that obtains, or you are dealing with a government that's committed to them in principle but not in practice, then then I think your national obligation.
So General Sisi met with journalists in Egypt. Okay, he had a big meeting with like 30 editors. He summoned them all, and he basically said, you guys are obsessed with freedom of speech. You should be focused on the national interest. You should not be whipping up scandals and agitating people and creating skepticism among the public. And this is your moral responsibility to ensure the national interest of Egypt. Now, some journalists in Egypt, I think, probably agree with that because of their own sort of perspective on the sort of threat represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. But of course, others are just intimidated. I mean, you see leaders around the world make this argument to journalists all the time. And I think it actually puts, Turkish journalists are another example. It puts them in a very tough position. And I'm not sure, at least from CPJ's perspective, I mean, maybe I would argue that the best journalists share this outlook, but there are many, many journalists who don't share this outlook at all, this liberal outlook, if you will.
Right. Well, I think there are journalists everywhere in the world who would like to have the rights and protections that we do in the West. And there are some group of journalists who are also quite happy being propagandists for their regimes. And there are probably quite a lot in the middle who don't feel they have any choice or latitude in the matter, and would probably support the development of freer expression, but are in a place like Egypt are so far from it that it's sort of an unimaginable luxury to them.
Yeah, but I think it puts journalists in a very complicated position, because if you're an Egyptian journalist, having been warned now, if you have a story that's a national security story, how do you treat that? How do you treat that, both from an ethical perspective and in terms of your own survival? I think they're really in a tough position.
Yeah. I just want to touch on this sort of issue of the reform agenda and what an organization like CPJ would like to see happen in terms of what sort of data is collected and what the limitations are around it. Now, maybe the biggest issue at the core of this is what data gets held by whom for so long.
Right.
And probably the core revelation of all the Snowden disclosures, the biggest thing is that the NSA was taking everything and keeping it forever.
Yeah.
And that's what Obama has said is unacceptable. And he's proposed this idea that the government wouldn't hold data; it would be held by the phone companies, communications companies, and carriers, and actually held for a limited period of time, and the government could access it with a legitimate subpoena. Is that the right answer on data collection, and do you think there's a good chance that will become the law?
It's certainly improved. What even private companies can do with this data is staggering. I mean, Google traffic, for example, how does Google traffic work? Tracking Android phones moving down the road, and they know the speed they're moving at, and so they're basically using your phone, tracking your movements, and anonymized, but your movements to determine traffic. So, I mean, I think there's another question is about how much information do the companies have, and how comfortable are we with that, knowing that the government could potentially get their hands on it at some point, and who knows what they could do with it. Now, just as an organization focused on protection of journalists and ensuring that the legal framework facilitates the work of the media, I think there has to be some recognition of the special threat that smothering surveillance, overwhelming surveillance poses to the press and the work that journalists do. And some sort of recognition that seeking information from journalists or spying on journalists, including journalists outside the United States, is something that should require, I think, some sort of higher level authorization. I don't know at what level, And I don't know the specifics of how this should be done, but there should be some regulatory framework that recognizes the critical role that journalists play, not just in this country, but globally, and limits the ability of government to access the communications of journalists.
Yeah. Well, one parallel is when it comes to criminal investigations in general. The Justice Department has guidelines that says it has to exhaust every other alternative before subpoenaing a journalist, which strikes me as a good place to start.
Yeah, that's an interesting place to start. Of course, that has to do with an investigatory process, espionage function. Yeah. So it's a slightly different framework. But another comparison is that the CIA has said, and they make very few public commitments, that they will not recruit U.S. journalists as intelligence assets in order to ensure that journalists who are working in some pretty dicey places have that deniability that, the CIA does not recruit journalists, does not use journalists, U.S. journalists as agents. I actually think they should say journalists in general, but they've never made that commitment. But I think that, even within the framework of an organization that, carries out espionage, is an important public recognition of the role that journalists play. And the fact that in many parts of the world, what people say about journalists when they take you hostage, is that you're a spy. So any distance that can be created between, espionage and, because what you're doing as a journalist, going around asking nosy questions in parts of the world where the press is not free and independent, sounds a lot like what a spy does.
I don't get from the James Clappers of the world much sense of recognition about that critical role that journalists play in free expression.
Keith Alexander, NSA director, his reaction to the Snowden revelations and the publication in the Guardian, I think you wrote about this, was one of something's got to be done.
We have to stop them from they're stealing secrets
and they're selling it.
You sent me something today I hadn't seen, which was an NSA or National Director of Intelligence directive from James Clapper. I guess it went out in March, that said it was essentially about contacts between anybody in the intelligence community and the press. And what it said was, if you had to boil it down to one sentence, there shouldn't be any.
Yeah.
It was amusingly Orwellian because it started sort of to serve the purpose of transparency and government openness. Yeah. No one can ever talk to the press.
Yeah, and it said it made no distinction between classified and unclassified information either.
Right. And it also said that if you were in this vast intelligence apparatus, which now numbers hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people and more than 1 million if you're talking about top secret security clearance, you had to report to your superiors accidental contacts with the press, i.e. if you were at a cocktail party and you found yourself in conversation with a reporter about the weather.
So I wonder if there's anyone I've had over for dinner or something who had to report to their superiors. I didn't know that it was invited to dinner at a journalist's house.
Yeah, bureaucracy at work.
Yes.
I'm David Hunt. I was in the CIA clandestine service for 32 years. And I can tell you that while you have represented a view of the journalists, I want to just give you a view of what it's like to be inside a service that is running, recruiting sensitive sources. And to do that, you need a disciplined bureaucracy at home within the agency that can protect those sources, because if that is lost, then you're not going to be recruiting anymore. Our contacts with the press were closely controlled, discouraged. When you had a social contact with a journalist, you were supposed to report it, because if you didn't, when you took a polygraph every 5 years, there was always a question, have you ever had any unauthorized contacts with the press? So it was a good way of keeping everybody honest. But if you're in the field working sources, your worst fear is that there's somebody back at headquarters on a desk with loose lips who has, goes out and have a drink sometime with a journalist, because believe me, they will press you. And I got calls from people in the Washington Post at 3 o'clock in the morning about Iran-Contra. And I used to say, John, his name wasn't John, please don't call me. I have to report it. And if I knew anything, I wouldn't tell you anyway. You can't disagree with at least the clandestine service having a strong discipline to protect the sources that it runs, because their lives certainly depend on it.
Yep. I mean, I think that's a very valuable rejoinder. I certainly agree. I had a younger brother who was in the CIA for several years. We're not unsympathetic to the idea of intelligence gathering in my family. I think the real question is, Well, partly the question arises, you're talking about when you started in the CIA, it was a couple thousand people? What was
In the clandestine service, about 5,000.
Right. The number of top secret clearances in the United States is over 1 million. I don't think it was an accident that we had WikiLeaks and Snowden within a couple of years. The number of people who had access to information was so vast, and the issues around the ethics and morality of what was being collected and what was being done with it were significant enough that it was simply implausible to think you could keep that information. So, I think government, in terms of its legitimate security interests and its legitimate secrets, has to think very seriously about how it protects what it needs to protect. And I absolutely think that part of that answer has to be many fewer people having access to the crown jewels.
Yeah, and I would only add to that some of the most important national security reporting that has benefited this country's democracy has been accomplished because of relationships between journalists and people in the intelligence world. And that there's, yes, you need a bureaucracy that ensures operational discipline. There's no question about that. But there is a question of just, do you expend ensuring that there is no contact whatsoever, given the fact that, these things are sort of happening in the same space. There inevitably are relationships, are conversations. So I think it's a really tough question. I think the conversation is enriched by having your perspective. But I think ultimately there's a response to these leaks and revelations on the part of the government that has the potential to stifle critically valuable reporting, and that's my concern.
I just want to kind of add one point. I think it goes back to this distinction between the public knowing what its government is doing in principle and knowing what it's doing in detail. I think the public has to know what it's doing in principle, and I think it does know in principle what the CIA does around human intelligence gathering. It didn't even really know in principle what the NSA was doing around data collection. But once that sort of is established and you have a sense of democratic consent, I don't favor people in government leaking the details of programs that put people at risk. I think the press has legitimate protections around trying to do its job, but it doesn't mean that everything should come out.
Given, obviously, the internet's supposed to be a tool that journalists can use to get information to themselves, but it's being used by repressive governments in the reverse direction. As a practical matter, what are journalistic enterprises telling their people to do to protect themselves against that and to protect themselves physically?
I mean, Joel can speak to this. Being a journalist in terms of your kind of being a national security journalist is a lot more like being a drug dealer or being a money launderer or being a Bitcoin trader than it used to be in terms of your attempt to use technology to anonymize, to encrypt your communications, using burner phones, I mean, it's sort of amazing. I mean, it sort of involves you in this netherworld of dodgy seeming activity to protect legitimate activity.
Yeah, and on the other hand, there's also a return of low tech. When The Guardian was doing its Snowden reporting, they just spent a lot of time on planes, flying to Brazil, because they just didn't feel there's any way that they could communicate or transmit their stories using the communication tools that we rely on. One thing that you have to keep in mind about the work that we do is most of the journalists who are threatened and the most vulnerable journalists don't work for large media organizations. They're actually working for small national media organizations in their own countries. So they don't necessarily have the resources and training and support that U.S. journalists or international journalists working for major media organizations would have. But when it comes to kind of information security, I'll make a couple points. One, most journalists, with a few notable exceptions, are ignorant about this issue and the risk. They are. And some are aware, but are overwhelmed because, they just, especially because the things that they thought were safe, now they understand are not necessarily safe because the technology is changing and the awareness of the government capabilities in terms of surveillance and intervention is growing. So if you're committed to using these tools and you want to be able to ensure the security of your source, you have to do what Jacob was talking about. The alternative is pen and paper. That works pretty well.
And we've had some really interesting conversations at CPJ about training journalists and our role, because journalists are looking for resources about how do you function in this environment. And I think the CPJ has put out a couple of really useful documents, and it's kind of taken some.
And I think the main thing we're doing, because the training is really challenging, technology is changing, but what journalists have to do and have to be aware of is they have to do a risk assessment when they talk to sources who are vulnerable. So how am I communicating with this source? Who might want this information? If they get this information, what are they going to do with it? And what steps can I take to reduce the risk? Those are the kinds of, and if you're reporting on City Hall, you really could care less about NSA getting that information. I don't know why they would, but if they, would have no impact whatsoever, then, But if you're a journalist in Pakistan talking to some Taliban and you have regular contact with them in order to do your reporting, I'd be very concerned about the communication tools that I use.
I just want to thank you both for a very interesting discussion. We have all learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.